But imagine if I said, okay, everybody, glad you're here. I've got a school bus waiting right out in the parking lot. We're all going to go get in it. And we're going to go somewhere. And it's going to be awesome. Now, some of you are like, ooh, adventure, that sounds fun, right? Some of you are looking for a paper bag because last time you were in a school bus, it was not the great experience, right? And if I said, we're going to go do this, here's my suspicion. You might have a question about where we're, like you might say, hey, well, where are we going? You might have a question like, hey, where are we going? I'm not anti-school bus, but like, who was in there last? You might have a question like, where are we going? When are we getting back? You might have some questions. I think it's a great metaphor about church. A few weeks ago, I talked about how, imagine if you went to an airport, and when you got to the airport, you realized that the airport had made itself to be so awesome, they stopped with the whole plane thing, and they just wanted to be a destination for you to go have expensive restaurants and an abundance of small drugstore type things, right? So, and they decided, you know what? We're just going to be a destination. We're not going to get people to anywhere, right? That's what a lot of people experience church to be. Church isn't supposed to be a destination. It's supposed to be an airport to take you somewhere else, right? But when you were a kid, you had some questions about the faith, and those questions got answered. But along the way, you started becoming an adult, and you started wondering if I'm even allowed to ask those questions. And as you became an adult, you said, well, maybe it's a dumb question, or maybe I shouldn't ask it. Or maybe when you were a kid, it was the sort of thing that just said, we don't ask those questions. And so coming to church feels like getting on a school bus that's old, dated, somewhat smelly, and maybe even full of bullies. And you're not allowed to ask any questions. A real faith should take you somewhere. And so if there's going to be a real, authentic faith, it's going to take you places, and maybe even places you don't want to go, or places you never expected to go. If that's what authentic faith is, well, you probably ought to have some questions along the way. It's a right thing to have questions. And if you don't have questions, well, maybe you're not paying attention, or maybe somewhere along the way people told you you're not allowed to have questions. As a church, one of the things we try to, as much as possible, embody is that, like, hey, real faith is going to have real struggles, it's going to have real doubts, it's going to have real questions, real concerns, and real curiosities. And if we're authentic about it, we can ask them and not be afraid of the answers or lack thereof. And it's with this spirit that we are doing our series called The God Questions, because there are real questions out there. In fact, we're going to take on the 5 most significant questions that maybe either you or your friends have out there. And this is according to some Barna polling. The top 5 questions that people who maybe do not attend church, or have chosen to not attend church, or stopped attending church, have when it comes to the faith go this way. The first one is my biggest reason for it is that it seems that the church is filled with hypocrites. The second one is it seems like the Christian faith conflicts with science. The third question people have about their faith is the presence of evil and suffering in the world. The fourth one is that people think that no one faith should be able to say it has all the answers. And the fifth reason that people resist the faith or can't really get with it is they don't know if they can really trust the church. So we've got 5 weeks. We're going to take one question at a time. Today, we are going to talk about hypocrisy. And we'll walk through in 4 points. The first one we'll talk about is the cost of hypocrisy. We'll read a passage. We'll talk about the drive of hypocrisy, the usefulness of religion, and maybe how Christ is different. All right, so let's start with the cost of hypocrisy. Everybody, if I asked you all, if you know a hypocrite, every one of you would say yes, and about 20% of you would raise your hand. All right, so everybody knows a hypocrite somewhere along the way. A hypocrite is someone who acts one way in public and then much less admirably in private. In my little rabbit hole of research on this, I found a study that describes there's 4 different forms of hypocrisy. There's inconsistency, a person who's all about doing it here, and not necessarily doing it over here. Okay, that's inconsistency. There's pretense, presenting yourself one way to people over here in public, and being a different person in private. There is blame, which was a surprising form of hypocrisy. But blame is a great way of reshifting the perspective. Rather than taking ownership for any problem yourself, you find other people to blame for what's wrong with yourself, the world, or this, that, the other. And constant blaming of others is a form of hypocrisy. And the 4th one is complacency. Jesus himself confronted the Pharisees, and he said, you excel at all these private disciplines like the reading of scriptures and the tithing over here, but you ignore the concern and care for widows, orphans, and immigrants. What's wrong with you, Jesus says to them. That's hypocritical, according to Jesus. And when all these things happens, the cost of hypocrisy is something tremendously important for humanity, for society, for our hearts. The cost is trust. The cost is trust. And when you lose trust, you lose social capital, things don't get done well, and the world becomes ever and ever and ever smaller. Researchers would say that we are in a trust depression. I'm going to show you a couple charts that describe how trust is being experienced, particularly in the faith. Back in the 70s, if you asked people a question, you asked them, can people be trusted? Almost 50% of people said, yes, people can be trusted. And then another, just a slightly higher percentage of Americans said, you can't be too careful with people because they can't be trusted. And then a very small, nuanced middle said, well, it depends on the situation, right? Well, as the 80s moved on, people said, you can trust people less. In the 90s, it was worse. 2000s, 2010s, it just got worse and worse and worse and worse. But over time, now regardless of this, for just most of that time, out there in the world, people would say you can't, increasingly you can't trust people. This is not good for society. This is not a good thing. There's 2 interesting researches, 2 interesting data points. I didn't bring a slide on this, but the higher someone was educated, the more they felt like they could trust people. And generally speaking, the more highly people are educated, the safer the living in situation they have, right? So there's a lot of correlations to that. But what was more interesting than anything else is that church attendance correlated with trusting people. The more people attended church, the more people trusted. And you could see a correlation with that in the 70s, 80s, 90s, the 2000s, but then it changed right around 2010. Look at this chart. You see, this is a chart as to, well, generally speaking, you could trust people, right? The top line is the 70s. And And what you see is church attendance is on the bottom. The more people attended church, the more they trusted people. And so it went up and to the right. Church attendance correlated with more trust. In the 70s, it was high. It dropped a little bit in the 80s. It dropped a bunch in the 90s. And it dropped even more the next decade. But what happened about 12 years ago is that the more people attended church, the less they trusted people. I hope you're freaked out. I'm freaked out as well. And we could speculate as to why, and everything that changes in 2010 can be blamed on your phone, right? That's certainly what we could look at. You could look at that. You could certainly look at a loss of mission when it comes to church. You could talk about consumerism, how oftentimes people choose their churches not based upon their theology, not based upon geography, but based on lifestyle brand. I've chosen to be this kind of person. I'm going to go to a church that agrees with me because I'm pretty convinced Jesus agrees with me. And so everybody just gathers into a space to find a guy like me who will say things that they agree with. To be around a bunch of people who would say, you're right because I'm right and Jesus agrees with us. And increasingly, people are not around people who are different than them sociologically or ideologically. Those are a few ideas. Truth be told, that's just me talking. I don't know, but it's a problem. And I believe that something of this sort is the reason why their biggest issue with faith is hypocrisy. Now, here's my thought on this. I don't think that people don't resist faith or disagree with faith because of hypocrisy. Now, that's a good smokescreen for people who don't want to change their life and they just want hypocrisy to be the thing. I think the real issue isn't hypocrisy. I think the real issue is hypocrites. When you've experienced a hypocrite, you have felt wounded. You have been wounded. It's the parent who demanded everybody look good at church, but was abusive at home. It was the pastor who said this thing in front of the people, but was doing this thing on the side. Maybe it's the perspective that the media gave, presenting all of the folks who made a mistake, but you've never got close to somebody of significance, or somebody who made a promise to you and they didn't keep it. Hypocrites wound. Hypocrites destroy. They destroy trust. In the wake of the wake of hypocritical actions leaves people wounded and hurt, and particularly when it's done in Jesus' name, it's really tough to sort out what's of Jesus and what's of the hypocrite, and to not put the two together. If that's you, I'm really sorry. I've seen it. I've talked to people. I've heard their stories. I have my own stories. Hypocrites hurt. And if you've known that person, or even if you've been that person, know that it really, really matters, and it counts, and trust is lost. Brennan Manning famously said this. This was about 30 years ago. He said, "The greatest single cause of atheism in the world is Christians who acknowledge Jesus with their lips, walk out the door, and deny him by their lifestyle. This is what an unbelieving world simply finds unbelievable. We have a Wednesday night men's group that's open to all. Anybody's welcome to join. But we have a couple of rules for that group. One of the rules for the group is we don't complain. We certainly don't complain about people who disagree with us, right? Because the church has to take responsibility. The church was in so many ways for so much time in our culture the center of culture. And so when people walk away from the church, it's generally speaking because of the church. If people disagree with you, don't complain. We need to find a way to listen. But Jesus has a story for hypocrites. And so what I'd like to do is I'd like to read that story and see if we can tease out maybe a couple thoughts that could help us think through and respond to this question. So I'm going to read from Luke chapter 18. Luke is one of the four Gospels of the New Testament that describe Jesus' life and the details of his teaching. Starting in verse 9, Luke introduces Jesus' teaching. Lucas says, "To some who are confident of their own righteousness and who look down on everyone else, Jesus told this parable. 2 men went up to the temple to pray, one a Pharisee and the other a tax collector. The Pharisee stood by himself and prayed, 'God, I thank you that I am not like other people, robbers, evildoers, adulterers, or even like this tax collector. I fast twice a week and give 1/10 of all I get.' But the tax collector stood up at a distance. He would not even look up to heaven, but beat his breast and said, 'God, have mercy on me, a sinner.' I tell you that this man, rather than the other, went home justified before God. For all those who exalt themselves will be humbled, and those who humble themselves will be exalted." Our second point is that there's a drive. There's something that drives us in our hypocrisy. And to introduce this parable, Luke addresses that. He talks about this parable that Jesus spoke was for those who are confident of their own unrighteousness and who look down on everyone else. Jesus told this parable. And he talks about a Pharisee. If you don't know what a Pharisee is, Pharisees were the popular religious teachers of that day. And oftentimes, Jesus was opposing them because of their hypocrisy. Now, you need to understand something about the Pharisees. We tend to have if you're in the church, you've heard of them, and you might have a bad impression of them. They were both the spiritually and the culturally elite in this day. Now, oftentimes in our day, the culturally elite and the spiritually elite are in different kinds of camps, but back in the day, they are all rolled up into the Pharisees. The Pharisees are like, kids, be like one of these guys. Be like a Pharisee. Like, look what he does. They do all the right thing. They make all the right choices. They do the right things. But this guy was confident of his own righteousness. And he clearly looked down on everyone else. And so when he went to pray, he went right to the front. Went right to the front. And Jesus said he prayed about himself, which is telling. And he says, "God, I thank you for me. I thank you that I'm not like them." Anytime people start talking about them, it's not usually taking them in a good direction. He says, I thank you that I'm not like the evildoers and the really bad guys and that guy back there. I thank you for me. And his spirituality was all about his opportunity to be an us so he can have a them to look down upon. He had no idea what he was doing when he was praying. He might have been using words, he might have been referring to God, but generally speaking, his spirituality was not about him and God, it was about him and everybody else. Him and everybody else who was wrong. Have you ever seen somebody have a religious experience, their faith becomes real to them, and you could see it change their life? All of a sudden you see the newness in their life, and they start making better decisions, and they start showing up to church, and so many things get right in their life, and you're really, really excited for them. But when you look a little bit closer, they're still as antagonistic as ever. Or they're still just as aggressive or controlling or as competitive as they've always been. Like, they've experienced Christian grace, but they're still like that kind of butthead sometimes about certain things, right? They've experienced some kind of grace, but how deep has it gone? It's like their character has momentum. They're able to change some of these surface things, but their demand to be right, their constant need to control, their constant competition, their constant drive for some of these other things, well, it doesn't seem like that's changed. The Christian faith talks about how grace can change someone's life and change the direction of someone's life and can transform a person's life. But there are certain things that are deeper into our character that take time. Grace needs to attach to things in our hearts to change those things. This was certainly an experience for me. I was that guy that age 19, man, things changed, and a lot of things changed in my life really, really fast. And I became a performer, man. I graduated. I went on staff with a mission agency. I raised support. I was leading mission projects. And you would think that something you can't deny that real grace had happened in my life, but there I was in Istanbul, Turkey, and I was just I was really, really mad, okay? And I was really, really upset. I was so frustrated with the team I had brought. I had lost patience. I had no peace. I was angry. I couldn't pray about it. I was just wrapped up. And I was rooming with a guy who had been a pastor, was a seminary professor, and he just said something to me, just kind of off the top of his head. I don't think it was off the top of his head. He had thought about this. He said, look, anybody who's going to be a servant in the faith, if they are not dripping with grace, they're going to become either a workaholic or a people pleaser. And I was like killing at both of those. I was both of those things. And I had realized that I had learned of some grace up here and changed certain areas of my life. But that drive to achieve, well, that hadn't changed. My need to make sure everybody thinks I'm amazing all the time, that hasn't changed either. Like grace had touched a few parts of my life, but there's these other parts of my soul that I was demanding to be in control, and I was demanding God to show up and order everything so I could look good and everybody could know it. Grace had only touched so many aspects of my life, and that was the biggest splash when my eyes are open to my hypocrisy. That hypocrisy hasn't all the way gone away because that's deeply embedded in my heart. I'm still drawing on grace to address it. But unless grace addresses the heart at the deepest level, faith becomes just a new place for a person's functional character, functional aspect of worship to play itself out. It becomes a new playground, it becomes a new field, it becomes a new place where we bring our control issues, we bring our performance issues, we bring our obsessions, our perfectionism, right? We just play it out in the context of faith. Some things change quickly, others change over time. We describe our mission this way, is that we are here as a church to help people find their way back to God. Certainly for the first time. But genuine Christian faith means that we're always finding our way back to God because our hearts are prone to wander. But what happens, though, is that we often see life as a ladder. And certainly this was true of me when I was new to the faith. I started reading the Bible, I started learning a few things. But there was these other folks who knew more, and that they had climbed the ladder further than I had. But I was like, I'm a competitor, right? I'm catching up. So I just started reading, and I'm like, man, I'm about to rung 3. And I realized, there's those other folks who are in rungs 2 and 1. There's some folks that don't even know where the ladder is. And once I got up a couple rungs, I got to look down on some other folks. And those who've been on the ladder a long time, you might feel like you're all the way up a ladder. You're right, you're like 12 rungs on the ladder. Now we all know the Billy Grahams, the Mother Teresas of the world. They're like at the, they're way up the ladder. And Jesus, he's at the top of the ladder, right? All right, and we kind of think through life in those terms. It gives us some folks to look down upon, but if we stay at it, we won't have to. We'll be able to look down on more people. But if you really want to use the ladder analogy to understand biblical Christianity, you don't put Jesus at the top of the ladder. You put Jesus in an airplane 30,000 feet above the ladder. Jesus never sinned. He was the Son of God incarnate as a human. He didn't struggle like we did. He overcame things that we've never even considered being able to overcome. His heart was true to God his entire life. Fundamentally different. And from 30,000 feet, no, it doesn't matter where you're on the ladder. Relatively speaking, we're all far from God. We're not going to get there by getting to the top of the ladder. And we all need grace to cover the gap. Hypocrisy forgets about the gap. Hypocrisy, what happens in hypocrisy is that we just see ourselves relative to everything else. And what ends up happening is faith just becomes this thing to feed that idol in our heart, whether it's making everything perfect, get everything ever under our control, making sure that we're just a little bit better than somebody, right? But that's not faith. The problem is religion becomes quite useful towards that kind of living. Why? Because when, you can go to the next point, the usefulness of religion, when you get involved in a church, you get a group of people to compete with. You get a group of people in your church to compete with, and then there's and then you can find, and there's insiders, and then there's outsiders, and there's this particular spiritual practices that church, and if you can do really well, man, you can quickly get up a few rungs and have some folks to look down on. The social media is a great place to look down on other people, right? To look down on the people who are looking down on other people, right? And if you get into like the religion sphere on social media, that's really awesome because there's all sorts of people you can look down on. You can be so confident in your righteousness that you'll never realize the tremendous gap of grace that has to be filled between you and God. You forget about the vertical dimension, and you don't need God. Why? Because you have all these people to look down on. Look at how good I am, at least relative to that butthead, And so why would you need grace? Because look at all these wrecked, messed up people. Look at what this person said. Look what this person said. Look when this person got to church. Look at all these people. I don't really need God. I've got plenty of people to look down on. And when you just need to be better than one person, well, why do you need grace? And that becomes my gateway towards hypocrisy. Comparing myself to others, or when we can, whether it's comparing yourself to others, making sure everything's right relative to others. All sorts of ways we can get there. and religion, which Jesus opposed more than anybody on this earth. Nobody opposed religion more than Jesus did. Why? Because it's the very thing that disconnects us from him. Because when our spiritual life is about what we look like or sound like or feel like or how we stack up against others, we disconnect ourselves from who he is. And when we do that, well, we lose everything. What religion does in a very specific way, though, is that it protects us from having to feel that gap between us and God. It protects us from ever needing grace. It protects us from ever needing forgiveness. The gap between who God created us to be and how we functionally live is way bigger than any of us are going to be able to meet. And so what religion does is it takes the life of love and the life of trust that God calls us to and reduces it down to a set of rules and practices and methods that you can do. And if you could do that, you can feel good about yourself. And if you don't do those things, well, you can feel guilty, and that'll motivate you to do those things. Or if you don't do those things and your guilt doesn't work enough, you can feel shame, and then you can feel like an outsider and wish to be an insider with the people who do those things, or just hate the insiders who do those things because you're never going to be able to do those things, right? And that's how religion works, right? There's the insiders who do those things. There's the slightly outside the insiders who are trying to do those things better. There's the folks who never did those things, who got frustrated because they were rejected by the people who do those things, right? And all in all, what the Pharisees did is they lowered the standard of what it meant to trust God and to believe in God to these things. You just do these 4 or 5 things, and that's what we do, and you can feel good about yourself. You don't have to worry about things like forgiveness or grace. And it's easy to look back at the way Jesus opposed them there, but we're masters of that in this day, right? I remember when I was a teenager, everybody who was older than me was just dumb. And I judged them for their apathy. I judged them for their control. I judged them for whatever, right? And then I became a young adult, and I judged the teenagers for being silly, and I judged the married people for being just weird and uptight, right? And then I was a newly married person. I judged all the people who just had kids because what's wrong with them, right? And then when I finally had kids, I had a whole bunch of other parents that I could judge because they weren't parenting like I was. And I judged them because I knew that they were judging me, right? And then eventually, when you get to that age, you judge the single people who just don't get it. And you judge the teenagers for wrecking everything for your young kids. We have this forever way of finding somebody, some kind of them. We could be just a little bit better than. That we could just be just a little bit up the rung on. Why? Because we resist grace. We don't grace. We don't want grace. We're trying to do whatever we can to avoid God as Savior. And that's when hypocrisy steps in, it takes over, and that becomes what an unbelieving world simply finds unbelievable. And if you're outside the church and you're asking these questions, you need to hold Christians to this very standard. If grace is what you preach, how come grace isn't what you live? But for us inside the church, if we are going to be part of the solution, it really is quite simple. It really is grace. And that is the very thing that ought to make Christianity different. And that's the last point. Christianity is different. If you look at the story, there's the Pharisee who's the model churchman. And all the parents said, be like a Pharisee. Jesus blew that whole thing up. He said he made the hero of the story the tax collector. Now we all sort of like, yay, the underdog, the tax collector. That's not how they felt about it that time. Think human trafficker, They felt about tax collectors the way we feel about human traffickers. And in this story, Jesus makes the human trafficker who abused and hurt a lot of people in his career the hero of the story. And yes, and Jesus says, be like the human trafficker. Why? Because the human trafficker was humble. And the beauty of it is anyone could be humble. All the tax collector did, think human trafficker in our minds, don't make him cute. He was an awful person through his life. He was an awful person. Damaged so many people, stole, took, sent Roman soldiers to hurt people, okay? Bad person. But what he did, which is something every single person could do, is he beat his breast and say, you know what? God have mercy on me, a sinner. And that's egalitarian. Everyone can do that. You don't have to be the wealthy person. You don't have to be an elite. This is something only the poor can do. Every single one of us can and should pray, God have mercy on me, a sinner. The poor can practice humility. The wealthy could practice humility. The cool could practice humility. The insider can practice humility. The outsider can practice humility. The pastor can practice humility. Those who are just exploring the faith could try on this kind of humility. Now, Jesus, I said, there's nobody has ever been more opposed to religion than Jesus. And make no mistake, he was hard, very, very hard on the hypocritical Pharisees of his day. He confronted them. He said, you guys are like whitewashed tombs. You look good on the outside, but you're like a dead person on the inside, and you smell and you're rotting on the inside. He was harsh on them. He warned the people, don't listen to their teaching, because they're teaching you they're going to teach you, they're going to lower the standard and teach you to avoid God as Savior, and they're going to teach you how to be hypocritical as well. But here's what Jesus never did to the Pharisees. This is what he never did to the hypocrites. He never did this. He never gave up on them. It's easy for us to look down on the hypocrites. Jesus doesn't look down on them. In fact, he keeps reaching out to them. In fact, this very parable wasn't against them, it was for them. And as you continue to read the Gospels, Jesus reaches out to the poor, he reaches out to the wealthy, he reaches out to the outsider, he reaches out to the insider. He never gives up even on the hypocrites. The reason why the church is filled with hypocrites is that our world is filled with hypocrites, and Jesus came to save hypocrites like me. The Pharisees made Jesus their spiritual enemy, and he continued to reach out to them. The Pharisees made him their political enemy. He continued to reach out to them. The Pharisees smeared him publicly, gossiped about him, told lies about him, and Jesus never stopped reaching out to him. This parable is Jesus reaching out to them. The real notion that needs to be corrected is not that there's hypocrites in the world, in the church. The notion that needs to be corrected is that the church is filled with people who aren't hypocritical. That the church is filled with good people. Remember, Jesus came to help people who have moral struggles and who are willing to openly admit their moral struggles, which means the church should be filled with messed up people. Broken people. The truth of the matter is, people of the world, particularly in suburbia, outside the church, are probably if you want to scale us morally, are probably better moral performers than people in the church. At least that's how it ought to be, because the people who come to church are not strong moral performers. They're people who need grace. That's what probably ought to be what describes us, not our righteousness. We're not any better in the world. In fact, on paper, chances are we might actually be worse. Why? Because we need grace. But when you know this, and you experience that Jesus continues to reach out to you, what ends up happening is we experience grace. And when we experience grace, we find ourselves looking up. And when you find yourself looking up, you're captivated by grace, you're captivated by love, your life is reflected of that, and you just have less need to look down. You have less need to find other people to look down upon. We find ourselves more secure, way less needy. Religion is for people that want to look down on others. Christianity is for people who want to look up at Jesus. And when we do that, hypocrisy has less to attach to. Let's pray together.